Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. This morning's focus is handling parental concerns and investigations. I'm Steve Barker, and I'm joined this morning by Linda Waghorn.
Good morning.
And we're here on behalf of Better Governor leading this webinar for you this morning. And please, as ever, ask us questions as we're actually going through. Hopefully you've got the question panel on, or dashboard, I should say, in front of you. That's your opportunity, or if you'd like to raise your hand at any stage and actually come on live on air and ask your question in person, you're more than welcome to do that. So just do that by raising your hand at the appropriate time. The aims of today's session are hopefully relatively simple and straightforward. What we'd like to be able to do is encourage you to reflect on best practice when responding to parental concerns and complaints in schools. We also want to ensure that there's an understanding of the role of investigations and also the function in actually conducting and undertaking those in schools in specific relation to parental concerns that presumably by that stage have actually become complaints. And also to, as I say, encourage you to ask questions, but also to share good practice, because undoubtedly there's a lot of good practice that exists in your schools right now on this subject. So please do be prepared to share, and as I say, hopefully we'll get the best out of the session for everybody. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda.
Good morning. On the 11th of January, the DfE published a new set of guidance, best practice guidance for school complaints procedures to be used from that date onwards, and it clarified and brought together a number of different issues that they had experienced as a DfE, because of course when complainants are at the end of the process at school and governing body level, they can the complaints will escalate to the DfE. So they brought together the range of expertise that they had and information they'd gathered and created this best practice guidance. So let's have a look at some of the things that happened as a result of that. For the first time, the DfE have issued a model complaints policy. So before this date, most local authorities would be working with their maintained schools and would issue a model complaints policy based on their service, their delivery at local authority level. And in academies and free schools, they have more flexibility, and so MATs have created their own complaints policies, and schools and associated academies have created their own policies in line with the expectations that they have.
I think it's fair to say, Linda, just interjecting there, model policy for us as governors shouldn't mean a policy that's actually cast in stone that we just take and put our school name on it. It's a model that we should use as the basis, as the fundamentals for building our own policy. And we're going to come on and talk about how we contextualise this for our own schools later, but I think nobody in governance should say a model policy, that's great, all we need to do is put the name of our trust, our school on it, and it's perfect, it's ready to go, because it's not.
All a model contains is the basic elements of the process and the expectations to be followed, and I will come on to that on another slide. There has been an expanded audience for raising a concern or complaint, so a much wider group of people can have an expectation that they will be listened to at school level. And from the best practice guide, a lot of information about good practice, what the expectation should be in any school, and some of the pointers to avoid the common pitfalls that schools have fallen into over the years. The model complaints policy suggests a two-stage process, which is quite a lot smaller than a number of schools have been using traditionally. The first level is that the school manages the issue at that stage, and then they hand over as a formal stage when it becomes a complaint to the governing body or the board. So we're going to take you through how that might work in practice. So the first thing is building on what Steve has just said. Your complaints procedure needs to be tailored to the needs of your school. I'm the chair at a small one-form entry primary school, and my experience, my catchment area, our children, our parents, our issues will be entirely different to the schools where Steve is a governor and the schools where you are governors. So we need to look at those basics of that process and policy and say, what is it about our ethos, our values, our school context, our relationship with our neighbours, our relationship with our parents, that gives us specific pointers about the pitfalls we want to avoid in our school. And that may well lead you to draw on your experience to date. What kind of concerns and complaints are raised regularly in your school, and what has the school done about that? Once you have tailored your complaints procedure to your school needs, and it's been approved by your board, it needs to be published on your own school's website. So even if you're part of a larger group of schools, your school has to have its policy on its own website. So anybody who's got a concern can find that easily and knows how to escalate or address their concern.
I think it's also fair to say here, Linda, that although this guidance is statutory or puts a statutory duty on to maintain schools, academies it doesn't, as Linda said, and therefore it's optional, but this is best practice. So those of you who are trustees or perhaps local governors, members of local governor committees in academies, it's worth thinking about, does your school or your trust currently have a trust-wide policy? And is that good practice, or going forward at the next review, should it be made more specific and tailored to your school needs? And have you got your own policy as opposed to a trust policy on your own school's website?
I think a model is always a good place to check off whether what you're doing is actually better than what the model policy is saying. So if you can check off all those points and think, actually we've gone beyond that, then you're in a good place. So your procedure itself should demonstrate how people will get a fair and full investigation, and it should respect their confidentiality. We've got new Data Protection Act last year, a higher level of expectation on schools and academies to keep records and information confidential and to manage the document storage and destruction at appropriate stages. So again, we need to be really clear that in our new policies for anything, not just complaints, that we respect confidentiality. And we need to be transparent about how and when we will give responses at each stage and how we will manage redress. And no organisation is perfect in every way. And accepting that there are and will be opportunities to learn and inform improvements. And whilst you might say, as a result, the policy was followed accurately, there may be areas that this particular concern or complaint has raised that allow you to think, well, in the future we can make it even better by making these changes. So it should inform improvements.
And I think that's just a good point for all of us as governors to actually bear in mind. That's actually absolutely central to our role as governors. This is governance. Governance is saying, you know, in schools above all else, of course, we are learning communities, but are we reflective and do we learn from our experiences? And very often governors who sit on panels of all sorts, including parental complaints panels, will be thinking to themselves, well, we could have handled that better. And as Linda said, it's a classic opportunity to go back, not hold a full inquest, but just say, are there any lessons we've learned? If we're in a similar situation again, could we actually do it in a slightly more improved way?
So I think rightly we changed the focus of this presentation today to look at the concern stage, because over the many years I've been involved in supporting governing bodies, managing things at the concern stage is usually where it goes wrong. Often you get to the end of a very complicated complaint process and the individual, all they really wanted was somebody to say, I'm sorry, it happened like that. There were things that could be done differently. So just to be clear, in the guidance, this is a direct quote from the guidance, we have many people in our school community, many of which you will never know as a board because our role is strategic, who will be concerned about something. They might be a bit worried about how something is going to work when there's a change in the homework expectations. They might be worried about their child and something their child has shared with them at home for which they want to be reassured that that wasn't the case, or that there was more to that story. And at this stage, it is important that we find a way as a board to ensure that our school is a listening school, does treat these expressions of worry or doubt correctly. I was visiting a school yesterday evening, and right by where you sign in, there was a little sign about expectations about visitors, and it said, if you are at all worried, we want to listen to your concerns. And right from the very first experience of a school, accepting that teachers are very busy, that receptions are very busy, we want to make sure that anybody who has a concern to raise has an opportunity to be listened to. And if we look at then where it drops into a complaint, this is at that point when that concern has been managed, and that person then makes a statement either verbally or in writing that they're dissatisfied with the answer that they've received, and they want more to be done. They don't believe that the school it has managed their particular concern properly.
Just to interrupt there, Linda, sorry. Questions come through from Gloria. Will we get a copy of the slides after this session? Yes, if you look on your dashboard, Gloria, and anybody else for that matter, there's a little document icon there. At any stage during the webinar or afterwards, if you click on that little icon, you can download a copy of the slides.
So this slide sums up the two stages. The concern stage being dealt with the school, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and then that formal statement, which is the complaint stage. So moving on to our first poll, the question that I would like to pose to you is, who is our audience for a complaint? So who can raise a concern at that school stage and formally take it through to a board complaints investigation? So if you'd like to indicate which of those, as many of those as you believe, would be the audience for those concerns.
The poll slide should be up in front of you now, the blue one, so you've got 4 choices, and you can click on as many as you like. Okay, people voting very rapidly now. We're up to over 50% of you already, so that's lovely. So if you want to cast your vote, now's the opportunity to do it. We'll give you a few more moments to decide. Okay, so nearly everybody's voted now. Last couple of seconds, so if you want to vote, now's your chance before we close the poll down, folks. And I'm closing it right now. And some interesting results there. We'll just share those with you now, so you ought to be able to now see the bar chart showing the outcome of that poll.
So up until the changes that were made in January, the formal process right the way through to complaints applied to parents of pupils currently at the school. Now, of course, for the vast majority of schools and academies, having a good relationship and listening to people that have concerns from a much wider audience was always a good idea. But they've now been included, all of those other areas, parents of former pupils at the school, neighbours of the school and members of the public. They can all now raise their concerns right the way through to a governor panel if they are dissatisfied with the response that the school has provided to them. So that expansion of the audience now includes all of those areas. So if we can hide those results, and we'll move on to the next slide, which is talking about that expectation where we as a board have influence over the particular aspect of creating that environment where people are listened to.
Just before we move on, Linda, we've got a question coming in here from Nick. Nick's saying, when you're dealing with an employee grievance and it goes to a local authority, HR and legal department, but they say you don't have the expertise, so it'll have to go to lawyers, who should be responsible for those costs for school or the local authority? That's a little sort of off focus this morning, Nick, because we're actually talking specifically about parental concerns here, but there should be a process. I mean, I don't know which local authority you're in, but I would be surprised if any local authority was immediately saying that if it's about a staff grievance, you actually send it straight up to getting lawyers involved, because all schools, all trusts statutorily have to have processes in place for dealing with staff grievances, for staff conduct issues. So there is always a school stage, as there is with parental concerns. And we've got one other question here from Maggie. How many people are part of the webinar? I'm not sure whether that's commercially privileged information. I mean, there's a huge number of you here this morning, so do keep the questions coming. We'll try and answer as many as we can. I'll ask for some guidance from the people at Governance for Schools as to whether they're happy for us to share that with you, Maggie. So not trying to be difficult, but I don't know how these things are actually normally shared. Linda.
Okay, so back to the culture, and as a board, we have for the last few years under the Ofsted guidance been responsible for creating a positive and ambitious culture in our school. So there'll be quite a lot of pieces of work that you'll be able to recognise in your experience as a governor. Now, first and foremost, the thing that we do as a board is we approve those policies and protocols. Those are the rules, the processes that we engage in school that are supposed to make everything work smoothly. And those policies and those protocols that are facing our audience, our parents, our pupils, our staff to some effect, they should all be on the website, and that is often the first place that people will go to look about how the school is run, how things are managed. We should make sure that we feel welcomed in that environment, that we have when we go into school as governors, that we notice those things, that we see how things work, and there should also be clarity to parents. So if I'm a new parent or I'm an existing parent, it's the first time I've had cause to be a little bit concerned about something, is there some clarity about who to contact if I need to? And we have a vast range of different ways in which our organisation will communicate with parents. They might send texts. Most schools still use newsletters. There might be an email system in place where you can email your child's class teacher. Do you understand, as a board member, how this works in your organisation? There's also feedback that you receive as a board in terms of parent, staff and pupil surveys. That's the way in which you formally listen to parents and collect views, and various other aspects in school are managed in a variety of different ways. I know a lot of schools will use their internet systems to collect feedback. Some have monthly polls on certain questions, but having listened to your audience and collected their information, how do you feed back to them what you've done as a result of that? So you've said as parents or pupils that you would like this, and this is what we've done as a result. Got a few questions that have come in.
Yes, we certainly have. We've got a question from Sarah. Do some of the changes in policy apply to academies? Well, Sarah, as we said at the beginning, this is non-statutory guidance. This is the DfE sharing best practice, but there is a statutory framework for maintained schools, and of course the expectation is that academies would also follow that good practice. So it doesn't actually apply in a legal sense, but it would be an interesting question for us as governors. Why wouldn't we, rather than why would we? John's asking, is a complaint the same as a grievance? No, it absolutely isn't. In school terms, a grievance is usually restricted to staff taking a grievance out against their employers, and there's a very different process for that. That could be a focus for a future webinar, potentially.
The only thing that I would say does come into scope under this new guidance is if a member of staff has a complaint about the governing body, which they may use that word grievance against the governing body, but actually that is part of this new guidance. The board does have to have a process for complaints and concerns that are raised against the board itself. So in that case, it would be. In all other cases, that would be out of scope.
And again, it's worth thinking, does your existing grievance policy, which is an internal document about how staff raise any dissatisfaction or concerns that they may have, because you wouldn't expect staff to actually go through the complaints process, they would go through the grievance, but does that apply to governance in your schools? Because it may well do. Ina is asking a question about processes and systems to track the progress. That's down to individual schools, really, and I think it's about us as governors knowing there is a process in that, but we're going to cover that in a few moments anyway. We've got something from Danielle here saying the ESFA are looking to publish some best practice for academies. Yeah, the ESFA, it's interesting that yeah, they're the funding agency, but there seems to be a little bit of overlap between what they and the DFE themselves are doing at the moment. But I had heard that rumour myself. It'll be interesting to watch that one and see where it goes.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide and pick up a couple of points that were made as we went through some of those questions. So we're looking first of all at, this is the school level. Raising a concern is done first and foremost usually through the child's class teacher or through the school office if it's a complaint from a neighbour because they'd expected to sit in their garden and enjoy the summer sunshine and they found that there was building work taking place during the summer holidays and they hadn't been notified. Then that kind of concern might be raised first of all through the school office. But in all cases, a concern is managed by the school in accordance with the policy that you've approved as a board and according to any protocols and procedures that you've got for handling that. And that will go right the way up to the head teacher managing that concern. For many schools and academies, you have got the benefit of a local authority support service who have been very involved in the past in supporting both the parent or the school in managing a concern and complaint, and many of you buy into a commission service, and again those often offer support for helping to manage complaints. So it could be that the school engages with them at an early stage, and if it's available I would certainly encourage that for those that might be of the more complex nature. The idea at this stage is that the school will, with that person who's raised the concern, make sure they understand what the complainant believes will resolve the issue. What do you want to happen as a result of raising this issue? And then at that school level, they investigate that issue, find out what had happened, and respond back to the person who's raised that concern. The report to the board comes in general terms, usually in the head teacher's report, and this is where those systems for collecting information, and certainly I know of schools that have a tracking system as part of their technology process in school, that parents can raise concerns and as they're dealt with they're logged. But you're reporting as a school to the board in general term the number of incidents, the number that have escalated to the head teacher, but at this stage it is general. We don't want the information to be shared and dealt with at board level because we're managing this operationally.
There's a couple of questions come through here, Linda, in terms of that specific, I guess, processes and procedures. One here from Andrew: can freedom of information requests be made from anonymous email addresses as part of parents complaining? I would say no. I mean, if they're anonymous, there's the physical practicality of how do you, but no, if it's part of a parental complaint, then you would expect it to be transparent. You're still respecting confidentiality, so there is no reason for it to be treated as a anonymous email. So my view would be absolutely no on that.
We've always anonymous letters and phone calls have always been disregarded, so I would assume that we would have a practice that would follow.
Absolutely. Chris is asking, should it be documented at each level for later reference? Yes, it would. I think good practice would always be for schools to keep appropriate records of conversations, emails, messages on Twitter and other forms of social media, and conversations. That's just good practice. It's certainly, if they're relevant to a concern that escalates to a complaint and then goes the full distance, yes, you would expect the school to keep records, and obviously confidentiality and safe records management would be part of that. we've got a question here from Carol saying, how can we best support parent governors to act as a governor when getting a complaint rather than the friend to the complainant?
This is about having the right processes in place, and parents often get, parent governors can often get pounced upon because of their role on the board, and it is about being clear. When I suggested at an earlier slide that there's clarity about how to raise a concern, it's also about making sure your parent governors know that if somebody shares something with them, that they similarly point them in the right direction, or have you mentioned that to their child's classroom teacher, because that's what you would be expected to do. But when you are choosing who you would, as a board, have as an investigator, or who you would have on a panel at a later stage, anybody that has an association or an interest that is a very obvious one would take themselves out of that, because they would have a conflict of interest, a conflict of being able to be impartial and give that their full attention in the correct professional way.
There's an interesting question come in here from Penny, asking really about, some local authorities only advising on practicalities, for example, follow your own process. So when we say local authority support, do we mean support from governor services? This will vary tremendously, Penny, from authority to authority. Local authorities have a statutory duty to, apart from other things, act as a champion for parents. So there is an obligation on most of them, is my understanding, that there has to be some mechanism to support parents. Now, you would expect the sort of reciprocal part of that to be some support for schools, I would have thought, but again, it's a question to take to individual local authorities. And of course, some people, some organisations, some schools would actually be seeking that from outside sources. There are lots of commercial operators out there, so multi-academy trusts, and many schools for that matter, can commission outside services from a whole variety of different providers.
The idea here is that at the earliest stage, we try and make sure that our school is listening and deals with it early, because when it escalates, it takes up a huge amount of time. At school level, how do we induct our new staff who are maybe new to the world of teaching? That first time they have a parent who's a little bit emotional and is raising an issue, and that person has not had the training or the preparation of managing that effectively, and sometimes those are the very situations that escalate. Okay, we've got a question from Ruth about how do you persuade parents that resolving a complaint is quicker and easier than putting it in a subject access request and waiting for the documents before then making the complaint. I think this is an interesting one. Subject access report is that which is linked to our new Data Protection Act 2018, where the subject, the person for whom you hold records, is saying, I want to know what you've got on file about me. There are two aspects of that. First of all, if you've got things that you shouldn't have because they're no longer a parent, then that's actually a breach of data protection rather than a complaint. But parents do things in strange ways. They'll sometimes take to social media to raise their concern rather than to follow the school's procedure. And again, it's about meeting early. If you are the governor concerned, Ruth, in this case, and you are doing the investigation, or you are the parent governor nobbled in the playground or at the end of the road, you then push that back to school. The school needs to deal with that concern according to its processes, because otherwise you will encourage people to take to social media. You will encourage people to tackle it in different ways, and the idea is that we try and avoid that. Subject access requests are a little bit flavour of the month at the moment, and people are jumping on that bandwagon. I can, so I will. A bit like when freedom of information requests first came in. We've seen quite an escalation in requests, but I think that will fade in time. But really, what is this person worried about? Let's sit down and have that conversation in that formal way, either at school level or if it is escalating in accordance with our policy.
And I think that comes back to what you said earlier, Linda, about what's the school culture. If we've got a culture where we want you to come and talk to us, the head teachers talk about open door policies, head teachers, perhaps more so in primary and secondary schools, very often are on the school gate or the school door in the morning. All of those processes, teachers being there to actually talk to parents, they're all designed to actually nip these things in the bud. So if you're concerned or worried about anything, come talk to us, and then it never gets to this stage. I think the only other thing I would say on the subject access requests at the moment is there's a lot of confusion between when people should put in a subject access request versus a freedom of information disclosure request. My advice to the schools where I'm the governor and to schools that actually ask the question is, even if somebody gets it wrong, it's good practice to say, I think you mean freedom of information, this is the information that you need, because very often a complaint probably wants both the subject access details, but also wants other documentation to be disclosed as well. So it's just worth thinking about how, again, as Linda said, our prime motivation here as a school is how can we get resolution to this? We don't want to see everything escalated. We want to see it nipped in the bud.
And good communication, clarify what it is they want and how they might want to use it. I think Tish makes a good point when she's saying that sometimes parents just like to get it off their chest. And I think that's true of many people who raise an issue at the first stage. It might be that there's a whole range of other things that have happened that morning, and that was just the last straw, and the poor receptionist or classroom teacher gets it because that's how it happened. And it may be that somebody just needs to sound off, and having people at school level who are trained to understand that, to not escalate it, to provide them with an opportunity to be able to get it off their chest, as we say. If we can do that in a way that isn't interfering with children's learning, because that's our primary function in school, then I think finding a way of doing that is useful. There will always be a small minority of complainants who are Mr. and Mrs. difficult and awkward, and we will have to manage those in as professional way as we can and with some dignity through the process, and it can be very, very difficult.
Anne-Marie's got a question which is actually very much about your last comment there, Linda. Anne-Marie's saying that a growing number of situations where parents are becoming verbally abusive to staff when they're raising concerns, are there any policies or expectations we can set with parents on acceptable conduct? There absolutely are, and I would expect, most schools ought to have some kind of policy. There was some very helpful guidance came out from the DfE, I believe it was November, it's just before Christmas, basically giving schools guidance. I mean, it's not new regulations, it's actually confirming regulations that have been in place for quite a long time, about how schools with very difficult situations can actually warn parents and ultimately can bar them from the school site if their behaviour is deemed to be in conflict with the not just the expectations of the school, but how we would all want our schools to be run. We used to have I'm struggling to remember what they were called now, homeschool agreements, where parents were signing up to sort of certain codes of conduct and things like that. But most schools will have policies, and most reasonable people wouldn't resort to verbal abuse, etc. But school staff are entitled to be protected from abuse, as are people in any other walk of life, and schools should have, governing bodies should ensure that their schools have policies for how they would respond to that.
I have, in the last 6 months as chair, written to 2 parents, reminding them that our school policy, our school values are respect and consideration, and questioning their behaviour, highlighting, as Steve said, that point about staff's well-being, and ask them to reflect on their behaviour and not to repeat it. So absolutely, we should have expectations in that area. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, there are some things which do not fit under this banner of concern and complaints, and these are some of them. So very clearly there are other legal avenues for which to pursue dissatisfaction about admissions, the statutory assessments for special educational needs and disabilities, for the formal exclusion of a pupil, and for whistleblowing, and as we've mentioned a couple of times already, staff grievance. So those processes, because they are covered elsewhere, are out of scope in terms of raising a concern through the school and then the governing body.
Just one other quick question before we move on here. So this is coming from Julie, and Julie's saying new guidance makes it very easy for parents to make a complaint in person, in writing, by phone, email, etc. Some schools do tend to find that emails disappear or aren't retained appropriately, confidentiality, etc. But Julie's saying that her school is thinking of developing a template complaint form to actually help this process for parents, asking would we think this is appropriate. Absolutely. I mean, my personal view is I wouldn't call it a complaint form. I would just call it a contact form or something like that, because then, again, it's that open door, open mind policy. If there's anything on your mind, if you haven't got the option to raise it in person, submit this form and somebody will get back to you.
You might find that there's something in place in your school already. I know some schools use a process where the concern goes to the classroom teacher. If the classroom escalates it to their line manager or the head teacher, it goes on a different colour form, and the head picks it up or defers it back to the classroom teacher with some advice. So those things are collected. Email systems can be useful in keeping that information together. But the important thing is what you're trying to establish is what do they want to happen to resolve their concern. And so collecting that, and if you've got some parents who are not very literate and they just want to make that formal statement verbally and have that written down, then a template is a useful document to capture that information.
Quick question here from Josh. Josh is saying on staff grievances, many staff will be scared to raise concerns or complaints directly with senior leaders and may want to go via governors, particularly if they know them in a less formal setting. Thoughts on this? Well, that's what we mean by whistleblowing on this current slide, Josh, and I think it's worth if we ever had any suspicion that staff were scared or in any way reluctant to actually raise concerns, we should actually, as governors, be asking questions about the culture in the school, shouldn't we, really? But yeah, that's out of scope of complaints here. That's absolutely a whistleblowing issue, and the policy should make it very clear whistleblowing is not informal at all. Whistleblowing should be in accordance with the school's policy, which must be shared with all members of staff, should be ready, available in school, etc. And there ought to be somebody on the governing body who is the named person. It would normally be the chair. It doesn't have to be, but you would usually expect it to be the chair.
And I would say, absolutely, this is about a less than positive culture where that is happening in school, and there may be some other things that the board is already engaging with to collect views of staff, exit interviews, staff surveys that they look at without interference. Okay, we're moving on now. So the school has completed its process of managing that first stage, dealing with that concern. The board has had a report in general terms, and the individual that had raised the concern has now escalated that to a complaint. So they may have filled in a form, they may have sent an email, they may have sent a letter, it may have gone to the school office, it might have gone directly to the clerk, to the governing body, or it may have come to the chair of the governing body. But at that stage, this now moves into the governing body's sphere of expertise, and they then have to have a process to manage how this happens. The guidance doesn't give a lot of information about exactly how this should happen, but clearly at the stage where the clerk receives the request for the complaint to be handled by the board, there has to be a process before you suddenly arrange a panel meeting and 3 governors sit around a table with the complainant. What is it they're going to be looking at? So we need to collect together information about what has happened already and to, as a board, ensure that this has been managed effectively. So we need to develop some understanding. So this is the beginning part of the investigation. So a formal complaint is received and a governor is assigned by the board to investigate. Now again, questions raised about parent governors. Anybody who is a parent isn't automatically disqualified. In fact, the bigger the school, the less likely it is that they will be, that the complainant will be known to them. But possibly the one that is most likely to have some inside knowledge about this is the chair of governors themselves, because it may be that this issue has bubbled up previously, and conversations have been had between the chair and the head teacher in their conversation, in their regular conversations. So who is going to be the governor? Who is going to be assigned to investigate? Well, we clearly need to develop some expertise within our board that says these people understand what the remit is, that they have had some training to understand what they are required to do, and they can manage this investigation impartially and professionally. And at that first stage, once this person has been assigned as the investigating governor, it is very useful to meet with the complainant and seek to understand and resolve their complaint. And again, it may be as simple as listening to them.
Just on that point, Linda, we've got a question coming through from Julie here. Can the person investigating the complaint be independent and not a governor?
Well, certainly if you are working within a local authority service and they're providing somebody that will help and support you with that, you're working within a MAT where you've got expertise wider within the MAT that could help you with that. If you are part of a federation or a collaboration where there's expertise, absolutely you can. If the investigation gets complicated or looks like it's going to be complicated at the beginning, you can commission somebody in to support that investigation. So you wouldn't want to do that with every single one because some of them can be quite easily resolved. But yes, it doesn't have to be somebody on your board if you believe you haven't got those skills. However, that should ring a slight alarm bell to say maybe we need to develop those skills as we go forward.
And I think that's something that all of us should actually be thinking about. I mean, Linda and I, in our professional capacity, have both been involved in conducting investigations as an external person for a whole variety of different schools up and down the country. But I think we would normally only get involved, and I think in fairness we wouldn't encourage schools to spend money they don't have to. We would only get involved in the most complex of situations. So perhaps it's something that an awful lot of people in the school are already aware of, which therefore compromises their impartiality. But more often than not, it's because it's actually been allowed to escalate and has become incredibly complex with a whole number of different people involved. And that process can be incredibly time consuming, of course.
So Carol has raised a question as a clerk. I just wanted to clarify. Some schools will only accept a complaint if it's put in writing, a letter to the chair. Well, what if you've got a person whose literacy skills as a parent or a complainant renders that situation difficult for them? They might have a friend who will help them to do that, but the guidance says a statement, and I think we have to be aware of our school community, a variety of people with different languages, which their first language may not be English. So I think, again, if we are thinking about positive culture, we are looking at supporting people with being able to make a formal complaint. So I think that clearly we can't prescribe everybody has to do things in a certain way, but I would suggest that accepting a complaint or supporting people in making a complaint is the first stage of listening. Absolutely.
Just a couple of quick questions before we move on there. Charles has asked a question, will whistleblowing not be tantamount to jeopardising the staff's job? Again, we're not talking about staffing here. This is actually about parents making complaints, but no, the whole point of whistleblowing is it's about protecting individuals from any kind of intimidation or threat to their employment, etc. So yeah, absolutely not there, Charles. A lot of people asking questions about whether it should be a 3 or a 2 stage. Again, this is not statutory from the DFE, and the key point the DFE are making in this best practice guidance is it's for schools to determine. Schools must have a policy. Whether you make it a 2-stage or a 3-stage, that's up to you. I think the thing that Linda and I quite like about this, 2-stage actually makes it quite simple. You're not saying to parents, well, before you do this, you have to have gone through this stage. So it is up to us as governors in our schools to ensure we have a policy that's fit for purpose. So however you want to do that, that's entirely up to you.
And I think if I'm absolutely honest, I would want all boards, all schools and academies to improve their practice so it's only ever a 1-stage process. We deal with it when people raise concerns. It is a symptom of a successful and positive culture if we don't have complaints that get to that formal stage because they haven't been dealt with properly at school level.
Absolutely. We've got one quick question here. When meeting with parents to talk on a one-to-one through a complaint, it's good to ask the clerk to attend so that they can record the meeting and then give the parent a copy of the meeting. Yes,
sometimes.
But yeah, again, as a panacea, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. Again, what you don't want to do is escalate it, and actually, the very presence of another person in the room can make certain people feel a little bit uneasy, uncomfortable, a little bit more anxious, etc. So again, with permission, or just using a professional judgment, well, if the head teacher knows this person, are they more likely to respond to a one-to-one friendly chat as a way of actually trying to resolve the issue, or would they want a more formal response? Some people would be more comfortable. So again, I think it's about fitness for purpose, and actually responding to the context that you find yourselves in.
There's quite a lot of questions around process, and lots of you have got different processes. Nothing wrong with having different processes. The overriding features here are positive management at the concern level and effective management at investigation and panel level. So if we can go through some of those things first, and then if there's remaining questions that haven't been answered significantly, then we can pick those up. But actually, it's up to you how you get to the end of the process, as long as when you reflect on how effective it was, you make some changes and do some learning. So let's finish off this investigation stage first. So we've met with the complainant as the investigating governor. We've made some notes, and yes, the person involved is entitled to see a copy of those notes. They don't have to be minutes, so you don't have to have a clerk there, but you do need to make some notes about the substance of what you agreed, because you're going to be open and transparent with the person at each stage of your investigation. You might agree the number of people, what you might want to see, or what the parent or complainant might want you to see, and who you might want to meet with in order to understand what has happened. And then you would actually complete your investigation. You'd scrutinise those documents, look at the evidence that supports or not against their complaint, and interview any staff, other parents as is appropriate. If you are meeting with pupils, that will usually be done, or always be done, in collaboration with the school, because there are certain safeguards that need to be put in place. And then, depending on what it says in your policy, your process, you will prepare some kind of document pack or report for the panel. Hopefully, at this stage, you might have been able to resolve that individual's concern. If you've got a three-stage process in place, this is that point where the investigator makes a judgment and writes back to the complainant and says, having done my piece of the job, I'm upholding or not the complaint. If you've got a two-stage process, this is about completing that document pack for the board, for the panel to consider. And the panel will have to be chosen, again, from people on your board that are the best people to undertake that role. So we've got to a point now where we've asked the complainant what they think will resolve the issue. We've communicated clearly at each stage that we're going to do as an investigator. We set out what we will do rather than what we should or we may do, so that there's some clarity, and we're very clear how we will move forward. Okay, so time for our second poll. Who should be informed about the substance of a complaint? So we've got this investigation going on. The board might, well, they will know that somebody has been assigned to investigate on their behalf. So who is it that needs to be informed about the substance of the complaint? I'd like to vote on this now.
Okay, so we've got nearly 80% who have voted already. So if you want to vote, folks, we're going to give you a couple more moments before we close the poll. So now's your opportunity. Okay, and we're going to close that poll now. and share the results of that. So you ought to be able to see the bar chart coming up on your screen. Yeah, it should be there now. And we've got some quite interesting outcomes from that.
So the correct answer here is that it is only the governor assigned to investigate. We are respecting confidentiality, as we've expressed earlier, and that person, the investigator, is doing that job on our behalf without any assumptions that what they're facing initially is the outcome. The clerk may have received the letter, so they may be aware of what the contents are, but they won't be aware of any other aspects of that, and they are bound by confidentiality. So just by the fact that they may have passed the letter on, it may still be in its envelope because it may be very clear that it was a complaint. The other two, all governors and the chair and chairs of committee, which is often a strategy group or called something like that, no, there is no entitlement to know the substance of the complaint. This will happen after the event when the panel has met and they report back to the governing body, the board, with any recommendations for improvements to process or practice. It is, however, many board members' habit to ask a bit more than they need to know, and it is at this point where they need to be reminded that until the process is fully completed, there is nothing to tell.
And also, I think it's well worth bearing in mind, and I'm sure we've got quite a few chairs of governing bodies and in on this webinar this morning as well, but very often it falls to the chair to remind other governors that, you know, much as we might like to have a salacious appetite for more and more information here, this is about what we need to know. And so when the full governing body does receive that report on what's happened, we shouldn't expect any real details in terms of who the pupil concerned was, who the parent was, year groups, anything like that, because we shouldn't be able to identify the people from this. This should be, from a strategic perspective, what was the substance of the complaint? In other words, what was the focus of the complaint, how it was dealt with, and as Linda says, the main role of the governing body is that reflection, and are there some lessons to be learned here?
So if we move on to the hearing itself, then we have a process where we have a formal panel, and your procedure, your complaints procedure, will indicate what those agreed timescales are. The guidance suggests that the whole process completed within a 3-month period, which may sound like quite a long time, but it goes very quickly if you're doing an investigation and agreeing interview dates and feeding back. Best practice suggests that you have a governor on the panel who is independent of your school, and again your local authority or commission service or your wider group of federation or collaboration group will be a good place at which to start. For maintained schools, that's best practice, and it's mandatory in academies. You have to have somebody outside of your trust to fulfil that role. The role of the panel then is to meet, and this can be at a time and in a place that is suitable for all. So it may be that the complainant does not want to meet on the school site, so you may need the clerk may need to arrange how that will happen. And there may be restrictions about when that person is available, and indeed there are restrictions when school personnel might be available if we need them. So this needs to be carefully constructed, and we need to offer more than one opportunity for that hearing to take place. But again, you'd set that out in your protocols. The panel's role is to review the evidence, look at that pack, that documentary pack that the investigator has put together, and to reach a conclusion based on probability. It's not a court of law. It doesn't have legal representation. This is looking at, on the balance of probability, did the events or events described by the complainant take place or not? And they then report back to the complainant with the conclusion of their discussions as to whether their complaint was upheld or not. The important part also for the complainant is that they understand if there are some recommendations that the board will consider going forward as a result of them having raised that complaint. So you might find, yes, the school did act within its agreed protocols, but actually it would have been very useful if they had fed back to the parent by the end of the school day rather than to have waited a week until an email arrived. So you may make some recommendations, or there may be that the head teacher themselves said, well, we could have dealt with this different. We've already introduced something to combat that. So that feedback, including recommendations, is helpful to all. And then, as well as feeding back to the complainant, the panel is feeding back to the board, in general terms, the substance of the complaint, any recommendations that the board or the school needs to discuss and consider.
We've got a number of questions coming through here about who can be on that panel. The idea of an independent governor, that is best practice, but anybody who is a governor, I mean, helpfully the DfE guidance now just talks about a governor. It doesn't say a governor of the school. And again, if governors would find themselves conflicted for whatever reason, you can actually go anywhere you like. I think one of the questions came through to say, does there have to be a formal agreement in place? Absolutely not. This is an opportunity for a bit of reciprocity rather than anything else. So if you've helped me out as a school fielding a governor for one of my panels, I'll do the same for you. Thank you very much. Somebody's also asked the question, can an academy governor sit on a maintained school panel? A governor is a governor. The law doesn't actually recognise any difference between governors in schools, so that's perfectly acceptable as well. And Linda, do you want to say something about the minutes here?
Yes.
There's a couple of questions.
The panel hearing should be properly clerked by an experienced clerk, and the notes that are created, and they are notes rather than minutes, because you're not going to be sharing them with all governors. So we're making notes of the meeting, and the notes can be shared with those people who were at the meeting. So the complainant, absolutely, we're trying to be transparent here and open, so we would be sharing those notes with them as a good practice document, but we are not sharing all of them. They're not minutes, so we're not sharing them with all governors. A question from Carol about asking for a lot of responsibility on people as volunteers. Well, we're volunteers up until we sign that piece of paper that says we are now governors, trustees or local board members. Then we have a set of responsibilities, and they do have some quite far-reaching expectations on us. Yes, it's time-consuming, but if we're trying as a board to get the culture right at school, hopefully we will see fewer and fewer complaints. And if we're training our board members to be alert to what they need to be doing on a panel or conducting an investigation, and there is support available, and I think in almost all cases there will be support available, even if you have to pay a fee for it, but you won't be managing very complex issues entirely unsupported.
And I think that's the key here. Our advice to all governors would be to ensure that you are seeking support, guidance and relevant advice as and when you need it. So yes, for governors to go in blind to a situation like this or any other form of panel would be an act of folly, to be perfectly honest. So governors need to ensure that they are adequately trained, that they're prepared for whatever eventualities may come up. The fact you're all tuning into this webinar and participating this morning is great. Hopefully this puts you in a much stronger position now to volunteer to be part of a panel. But again, on the day, think about who is your provider of support. And that might be your local government services through your local authority. It might be through a commercial organisation. It might be through an online service such as Better Governor. But it doesn't matter where you get it, but just make sure you have got the advice, because that will support you in the process.
Carol has raised a question around recordings of interviews or panel meetings, and again the guidance does suggest that this should be considered. It doesn't tell you have to or that you shouldn't, but I would think that you would need to think carefully about how long you keep recordings and how they're managed and who they're shared with. But yes, there are it does provide for that in the guidance. Some of the other questions that have been received, and there have been quite a few, are around your own process. And as I said before, there's no prescription that you have to do it in this way or you have to not do it in a particular way. You are aiming for transparency, for settling the concern at the earliest possible point, and for ensuring that you are learning lessons for the future in terms of making improvements.
Stephen's asked a question here, who would we recommend as the best person to ask for advice on serious issues? I think it's quite a difficult question to respond to in many ways, Stephen. I think it's about thinking, as a governing body, where do you get your advice, support and guidance from initially? And as with everything that we're responsible for in schools, we should be conducting a value for money exercise on that. Do we think that that advice is valuable? Is it helpful? Is it useful? If it is, that's where I'd be going.
And the same with, you know, people who, the same organisation that you have that develop that relationship with can also help you in finding who and how to link with impartial governors from other schools, I would suggest.
And I would just add on that, and again, without wishing to offend, I know we have quite a few people working in the legal industry probably tuning in this morning, without wishing to offend any of them. It's not necessary for the vast majority of complaint handling processes in schools for lawyers to be involved at all. It really isn't. And
the guidance makes that very clear.
Absolutely. There are too many schools now, there are too many trusts and multi-academy trusts, in my view, who are spending money on legal fees which should be spent on children's learning. Governors should be able, with the appropriate support, which they're probably already paying for, should be already paying for, to do this without involvement of lawyers. Okay,
there's quite a lot of questions, but in respecting the needs of others who are, you know, taking busy time out from work, I'm just going to finish the presentation, and then those of you that can't stay will be able to complete all of the slides. The only thing that I wanted to put up, make sure that you understood that there are times when people become serial complainants, if you like, and they're dissatisfied and they keep trying to open the same issue again and again. There is a process for that. They receive a letter that says the process has been completed and the matter is now closed, and then further correspondence on the same issue can then be deemed serial or persistent, and you can sometimes the school will say we are now treating this as a serial and persistent and we will not be responding, or you can simply refuse to accept correspondence from vexatious complaints. And I know some schools have been literally bombarded with emails or requests for information that then fall into this category of vexatious complaints. Luckily, they are few and far between because they do suck up quite a lot of time and they are emotionally quite difficult. That concludes the slide set for the whole of this morning's webinar. The handout is on the webinar pack for you to download. There are quite a number of questions here. We'll answer just a few more, but we won't take any more questions now because we've already got quite a number there. But if you are logging off now, thank you for joining us. Please do the little survey at the end. If you are staying with us, we will just answer a few of these questions before we go.
And if we don't get around to answering all the questions this morning, folks, we will actually make sure that we capture them all, and we'll get back to you directly with a few emails on that. So just picking a few, several people have asked, will there be a recording of this webinar? Yes, absolutely. Governors for schools will be putting that up onto their website in the next day or so, and that does actually include the outcomes of the polls. So the recording of the webinar has the poll questions. It will also show you that bar chart with all the results. So all of those will be available on the recording. We've got a couple of questions again coming up about recording. The only thing I would add on the recording, and again I'm assuming that people mean they're taking some kind of recording of device in. A recording of somebody's voice is actually their personal data, so there are implications there in terms of data protection legislation, but also you have to seek consent for that. So I think that's actually something to actually be thinking about.
That also brings in how long you keep the recording for, and
Exactly.
How it's destroyed. Those are all parts of your data management protocols.
Tyrone's asking, is there step-by-step good practice guide? Well, actually, in a way, that's what the DFE guidance document that we put up right at the beginning of the session aims to do. It's quite brief, it has to be said, but certainly it's a very helpful starting point.
And if you're buying commission services, governor services, local authority services, or within multi-academy trust service, you might find that there are some good practice guidance notes associated with those organisations that you can benefit from as well, and they will be updated in the light of the new DFE guidance.
James asked a question about recruitment, saying what we should be doing is actually reviewing how we recruit our governors and explain responsibilities up front. So it's not a question, it's a statement. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that. We should be open, honest and transparent with all prospective governors about what's involved. So I think that's a very sensible suggestion.
Stephanie's asking about mediation, and there are many local authorities who can point you in the right direction of mediation. If you get to a point where you this is a possibility, then I think that's the first point. You go to your local authority, your governor services, your MAT board, and ask whether that would be useful. Again, it will have a charge associated with it.
And I think the only other area that we haven't actually touched on yet is several questions about, can parents bring in external support? Absolutely, parents are entitled to bring, and I think schools probably ought to make sure this is actually mentioned in the policy. They can bring a supporter if they want to. Again, we have seen a little bit of an escalation in some parts of the country. One of the schools where I'm chair, actually in Surrey, we actually had a QC come as a supporter for one parent for one particular hearing that we were involved in. That's perfectly fine, but again, if you're on a panel and that happens, don't be intimidated by that. Just think this is a school process. It's not a court of law, and therefore the court of law or courtroom procedures and ways of doing things do not apply. This is a school process led by the school using school processes. Some of those advocacy services, or the word mediation was used, but they tend to be referred to as advocacy services that are there for predominantly to support parents of pupils who've been excluded, do get involved in parental complaints and concerns from time to time in terms of support for parents as well.
But again, I would say don't be frightened of that as a panel member. If your investigation has been thorough, you are referring, you're making your decisions based on the evidence in front of you. If the evidence isn't there to support one side or the other, then you can't, you're not in a difficult position in terms of saying, that is not, we don't have that information that supports that view. So you do need to do your bit in reading what you're provided for with the pack and making sure that you have that positive, open, transparent culture in terms of the way the school's dealt with it and the way you're dealing with it.
Indeed. And I think time has eluded us there, rather, folks, so we will call a halt to proceedings there. As I say, if there are any questions we haven't responded to, we've got them all in front of us, so we'll get back to one or two of you with some direct responses. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you very much for your participation. There will be more webinars coming, so watch this space, and Governors for Schools will let you know when they are, but we look forward to welcoming you again in the near future. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.